Bias in Legislation, Enforcement, and Sentencing Policies Concerning Controlled Substances by Brandon Carone, Natalie Rodstein, and Jacqueline Vizcarra.
In June 1971, Nixon officially declared a war on drugs, stating that drug abuse was the public enemy number one. He created the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is responsible for tackling drug use and smuggling in the U.S. Together with the DEA, the government formed new laws targeting the specific drugs used primarily by minority groups. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 to over 2.2 million people. Though this was the official beginning of the war on drugs, U.S. laws have targeted minority groups since the late 1800s.
Towards the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, several laws were enforced to impact minority groups such as Chinese, Black, and Mexican Americans. These laws were first instated at the federal level in 1914. In the early 1970s, efforts to regulate the use of controlled substances increased with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which categorizes controlled substances based on their medicinal use and potential for addiction, followed by Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs. During Reagan's term and thereafter, the war on drugs shifted its focus from treatment to incarceration with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which created the first mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenses.
There are 5 distinct categories or schedules depending upon the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. A drug is considered Schedule 1 if it has a potential for abuse and the potential to create severe psychological and/or physical dependence. Schedule 5 drugs represent the least potential for abuse. While drugs are generally categorized by the scheduling guidelines, those in power usually have great influence over where the drugs are officially placed. While marijuana has proven effective in various medical uses, it has remained a Schedule 1 drug since scheduling was created. Here's a quote from the first U.S. Narcotics Commissioner, Harry J. Anslinger, describing the effects of marijuana. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are blacks, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This is an example of how the biases of congressional leaders may influence laws pertaining to controlled substances. While the main argument for the war on drugs was to disrupt the sources, there are more than 6 times as many arrests for drug possession as for drug sales. America has 25% of the world's incarcerated population, even though we only make up 5% of the overall population. There are 2.3 million prisoners in America, and about 600,000 of those prisoners are drug offenders. Here's a figure showing the disparity between white and black Americans in the prison system. While African Americans are no more likely to use or sell drugs than whites, they are much more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for drug offenses. Between the years 2007 and 2009, drug sentences for black men were 13.1% longer than drug sentences for white men. In 2004, African Americans made up a whopping 43.3% of the incarcerated population, while only making up 13% of the U.S. population. This racial disparity is partly due to biases in the creation of controlled substance laws. For example, from 1986 until 2010, drug offenders would receive the same mandatory 5-year sentence for 5 grams of crack, which was the type of cocaine primarily used by African Americans, as they would for 500 grams of powder cocaine, the type primarily used by whites. The notion that harsh mandatory minimum prison sentences could seriously dampen the drug trade has collapsed in light of the manifest failures of the drug war.
So what may have caused all of these biases in the controlled substance laws and enforcement? For better or for worse, our brains have evolved complex systems of bias that affect our perceptions of the world around us. Racial bias involves a number of different regions of the brain, including the amygdala for fear responses, the fusiform facial area for recognition of other race and same-race faces, the anterior cingulate cortex and lateral prefrontal cortex for behavioral regulation, and the medial prefrontal cortex for mentalization. Researchers use a number of techniques to study activity in these regions, including functional magnetic resonance imaging, measurement of event-related potentials in EEG signals, and transcranial magnetic stimulation. One way in which humans are biased is in our empathy responses. An fMRI study conducted in post-apartheid South Africa in which participants watched videos of black and white models experiencing neutral and painful stimuli measured the difference in brain activity between the two types of stimuli. For several brain regions, the researchers found that there was more activation change when watching the same race model videos than the other race model videos. The regions in which this effect was observed were the precuneus, retrosplenial cortex, frontal pole, and temporoparietal junction. These regions are all part of the default mode network, which is involved in cognition. A similar fMRI study conducted in China with white and Chinese participants found significant biases and activation change in the anterior cingulate cortex and supplementary motor area. Another study in Italy with black and white subjects found similar results. The previously mentioned study in South Africa also looked at differences in brain activation in response to seeing people who were in neutral situations versus in social distress. The results in this experiment were similar to that of a physical pain experiment, showing significantly attenuated responses to other race social pain compared to same race pain. Significant differences in activation change were observed in the precuneus and temporoparietal junction as they were in the physical pain experiment, as well as in the inferior frontal gyrus and the intraparietal sulcus. One possible consequence of racial biases in empathy is the disparity in charging and sentencing between black and white men. A Yale law study of 2007 to 2009 crime data found that even after controlling for a wide array of factors including arrest offense, prosecutors still charged black men with offenses that carried mandatory minimum sentences nearly twice as often as white men. This difference in mandatory minimum charges was found to be a major contributor to the 14% black-white disparity in sentencing. This disparity makes more sense when considered in the context of racial empathy bias. If the prosecutor is white, which is often the case, the findings on empathy bias suggest that he would feel more empathy for the social pain experienced by a white man sentenced to prison than for a black man sentenced to prison. Because of this, he may be more reluctant to charge a white man with something carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. Another result of empathy bias may be seen in the disparity in mental health evaluations and treatment after arrest. One study found that African Americans, possibly due to stereotypes of criminality and a resulting perception of them as typical criminals, were significantly less likely to receive a psychiatric evaluation after arrest than whites. A lack of perception and empathy for the physical or psychological pain of African Americans by white law enforcement officials due to empathy bias may explain part of this disparity. If someone does not perceive or empathize with someone else's pain, they will not do anything to try to solve it. Therefore, white officials may not feel as compelled to refer African Americans for psychiatric evaluations.
To better understand how stereotypes affect racial categorization, Bartholow and Dichter conducted a study that tested whether the presence of stereotype incongruent information would slow categorization of faces by race. It also sought to demonstrate how conflicting responses can arise within the same trial when some of that information is stereotypically incongruent with the relevant target. Their methods are similar to that of the implicit bias association test. Participants categorized black or white male faces that were flanked by words associated with common stereotypes of blacks and whites. For one experiment, response times were recorded, and for the other, EEG recordings were used. The amplitude of the N2 component of the event-related brain potentials from the EEG, as seen in the charts, corresponds to conflict elicited by a particular stimulus. In this particular graph, we see that the N2 amplitude was larger on incompatible versus compatible traits as predicted. This means that participants more quickly categorized faces flanked by stereotype congruent words than faces flanked by stereotype incongruent words. The same data was used for these graphs, but this time analyzing it using lateralization of the readiness potential, or LRP, which is thought to reflect activity in the motor cortex associated with preparation for executing a behavioral response. As a participant prepares to make a motor response, a negativity develops in the ERP that is largest at scalp sites contralateral to the responding hand. For the purpose of this graph, negative deflections in the waveform reflect preferential activation of the correct response, and positive deflections indicate preferential activation of the incorrect response. These data indicate that incongruent flankers, or stereotypes not typically associated with the current target, generated conflict in response channels. One potential consequence of this stereotype activation could be the growing issue of racial profiling. National surveys conducted by the Department of Justice find that, while African Americans may be subject to traffic stops by police at similar rates to whites, they are 3 times as likely to be searched after being stopped. Disparate practices of law enforcement related to the war on drugs, in combination with sentencing policies, represent the most significant contributor to disproportionate rates of incarceration. For example, there is more drug-related policing in communities of color, which has caused African Americans to be prosecuted for drug offenses at an extremely disproportionate rate. Another issue resulting from stereotype activation is its potential to activate fear, which can result in disproportionately violent encounters with police for members of minority groups, especially the Latino and Black communities, who are arrested for or suspected of drug offenses.
Joshua Corll of the University of Colorado Boulder developed a first-person shooter game which presents the participants with several different images including both armed and unarmed Black and white men in different backgrounds. The goal of the game is to shoot the armed targets and to avoid shooting the unarmed targets. As you can see, those who participated in the study were much more likely to mistakenly shoot unarmed Blacks and much more likely to mistakenly refrain from shooting armed whites. They noted that individuals with higher implicit bias scores against Blacks showed disproportionately increased amygdala activity to images with armed Blacks relative to armed whites. Participants also showed heightened activity in the visual cortex in response to armed Black faces and heightened communication between these visual areas and the amygdala. Building off of these results, we can assume that police officers with higher implicit biases will be much more likely to act out violently towards minority groups.
So, now that you're aware of the bias concerning controlled substance regulation, you're probably wondering how we can combat it. Some possibilities for decreasing these biases include giving psychiatric evaluations for substance abuse disorders to all drug offenders to eliminate racial bias in referrals, increasing the accessibility of addiction treatment for low-income Americans by addressing disparities and cost barriers in healthcare, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences as they are disproportionately applied to racial minorities and have not proven effective in decreasing drug use, releasing those incarcerated for marijuana offenses in states where the drug has been legalized, and implementing a justice reinvestment strategy.
One of the ways to reduce bias in legislation, enforcement, and sentencing policies concerning controlled substances is through justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment is a data-driven approach to improve public safety, reduce corrections and related criminal justice spending, and reinvest savings in strategies that can decrease crime and reduce recidivism.